Hey all, I'm John Avlon, and this is Reality Check on the extremist beat. So, the January 6th attack on our Capitol was ugly and unprecedented. It was a violent mob trying to stop the constitutional certification of a free and fair election. And in that riot, you might have noticed folks wearing fatigues and flak jackets with patches from their own self-styled militias. Their actions have resulted in the indictments of more than 20 members of the Oath Keepers and 3 Percenters paramilitary groups. Amid fever dreams of a Trump reinstatement, some of the ex-president supporters still expect these militias to spark a second civil war if necessary. Listen to what one rally goer told CNN's Donnie O'Sullivan.
Ron, you genuinely believe that he's
coming back.
That he could come back as soon as
Before the middle of August.
And what if that doesn't happen?
Huh?
What if that doesn't happen?
We're going to be in a civil war because the militia will be taken over.
See, these self-styled militia groups didn't emerge out of a vacuum. They draw on a long history going back to at least the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terror organization comprised of Confederate veterans dedicated to resisting the rights of freed slaves, fighting the federal government. Fast forward to the 1960s, and a new wave began to emerge, like the Minutemen, who saw themselves as a patriotic resistance against a one-world government, doing military drills in advance of what they said was a plan to confiscate all private firearms by the end of 1965. Spoiler alert, didn't happen. They ran afoul of the law, though, after a plot to blow up City Hall in Washington and half-baked plans for a cyanide attack on the United Nations building in New York. A decade or so later, so-called sovereign citizens groups gained traction, claiming that only local governments were legitimate, making sheriffs the highest law of the land, and using that logic to refuse paying federal taxes. In the 1990s, so-called patriot militia groups proliferated, motivated by deadly standoffs with federal agents in Waco, Texas, and Ruby Ridge. Many combined Christian nationalist beliefs and anti-government rhetoric that ultimately inspired Timothy McVeigh to blow up the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 men, women, and children. So you can see these self-styled militia groups have a long history of creating real violence out of grievances and conspiracy theories that echo across the decades. Well, CNN's Sarah Sidner has been crushing it on the extremist beat. She joins me now for an in-depth talk about America's militia problem, past, present, and future. Your reporting on the extremist beat has gone deep in a lot of different areas, including these self-styled militias. You went to Ohio and you interviewed some of the folks in the hometown of one of the arrested Oath Keepers. What did you learn on the ground there?
It was really interesting. You know, this is a small town, Woodstock, Ohio. One of the Oath Keepers who is currently accused in the insurrection as being one of the leaders was both an Oath Keeper and also had her own small self-styled militia. Her name is Jessica Watkins, and she's currently in jail awaiting trial in the January 6th insurrection and her role in that. And we ended up just finding her boyfriend, Jessica Watkins' boyfriend. And we asked him what was going on. You know, how did this all come to fruition? And he says, oh, well, she was just there to be, and we hear this over and over again, to be security for VIPs. You will hear that with a lot of different of these militia groups, Oath Keepers included. But it's fascinating to learn that when you hear about these groups, it really is, in some instances, a place of belonging for people. Mm-hmm. And we heard a lot about that from her boyfriend, who said that one of the other men who was accused in the insurrection, who was living in this town, living in this little house behind a house, he said, look, he was an alcoholic, he was having trouble with these things, and joining our group gave him purpose. It helped him. It also ended up with him and her and others inside of the Capitol, side by side. And now he has also been arrested and accused in the insurrection.
And Sarah, that's such an important point you make about how these militia groups recruit by offering a sense of belonging, of structure and purpose. But as you also report and is documented, that can lead to something far darker. You report on groups of members of a Michigan militia, which is accused of a plot to kidnap and possibly kill the Democratic governor of Michigan. One surreal aspect of the reporting is the sheriff almost seeming to take their side. Let's listen.
Well, it's just a charge, and they say a plot to kidnap. And you got to remember that, are they trying to kidnap? Because a lot of people are angry with the governor. And they want her arrested. So are they trying to arrest, or was it a kidnap attempt? Because you can still, in Michigan, if it's a felony, you can make a felony arrest. And it doesn't say if you're an elected office that you're exempt from that arrest. So I have to look at it from that angle, and I'm hoping that's more what it is. In fact, these guys are innocent until proven guilty, so I'm not even sure if they had any part in it.
What's with this occasional sympathy we see between some local law enforcement and these armed vigilante groups?
It's one thing, to say it in the privacy of where there's not a lot of people around, and a lot of people suspect that happens, but to see it in person, almost defending those who were accused, who of course are innocent until proven guilty, although one of the defendants has pled guilty in this plot against Governor Whitmer. It was striking to see that play out. But you asked about the history. And as you know, there is a history of coziness, if you will, between militia groups in particular and county sheriffs. I spoke with a former FBI agent in the area there in Michigan who said that he is well aware that there has been this relationship, one which this agent said he wasn't too troubled by, which I also thought was interesting, because he said oftentimes the sheriffs and these militias are working together with things like, trying to find missing persons or, trying to help out with some of the law enforcement work that maybe the sheriff doesn't have enough staff for, which can be concerning in some of these areas. But trying to find someone who's missing is something that I think everybody's sort of altruistic about and say, okay, well, if these guys can help because they have some skills in this area, why not? And we should say, not all sheriffs. The Sheriff's Association, as soon as they saw what Sheriff Darleaf said, they came after him. They said, this is completely dangerous what you are saying about these people and this plot. That is absolutely not what we believe. So we shouldn't lump every sheriff into this, but there is a history, and it is proven again and again of a coziness between militias and sheriffs. But you also have the other side to this, which is one of the biggest concerns of these militia groups is that the government is coming for their guns. That's what's in their head. Conspiracy theories loom large. This idea, particularly that the federal government is out to get them. There is a long history of that being part of this group of people who believe that there's preparing for something, potentially preparing usually for the federal government to swoop in and take away all of their rights. So that's kind of in the back of the minds of these paramilitary organizations. And we should be clear that while the Second Amendment does talk of a well-regulated militia, which is always what you hear from these groups, that they can exist because the Second Amendment allows for these well-regulated militias. If you look at the case history, the Supreme Court ruled twice, back in 1886 and in 2008, so recently, that doesn't prevent bans on these private paramilitary organizations. There really are no legal militias in this country. The thing that would be considered a militia are basically sort of the state organizations that are there that are sanctioned by the state, which there are no private militias that are sanctioned by the state.
That's exactly right. The equivalent of what is now the National Guard was what a state militia once was. And I always appreciate one aspect of your reporting, which is an attempt to empathize with the people you're covering. And I think it's reflected there in just understanding what motivates these people and how old the echoes are. Whether it's fear of the federal government coming to take your rights, a game that's been played forever, or this elevation of the sheriff as the only legitimate local law enforcement. But here's the real deal, right? We know that these self-styled militia movements can erupt into violence. We see it over and over and over again. So when you hear this talk about a second civil war, how concerned are you? Not that it will actually happen, but that some folks seem to be increasingly encouraging it.
Very concerned. And maybe, to be fair, maybe I'm a bit skewed because I delve into these things. I go down the rabbit hole, if you will. And, yes, as you well know. But we've heard this over and over again, this preparing for civil war, and we were hearing it more and more and more. There are some people, and not a huge number of people, but enough, who believe that if they can just spark the right moment, if they can just get the right edge, if they can just find the right issue, that they will spark this civil war. And the Civil War, interestingly, when you think about it, yes, race is part of it, but it's also about the left. It is also about left versus right, conservative versus liberal. There's also a lot of politics injected into that.
We do not want a civil war or anything. We want to exercise every possible way before that comes an option.
Is that an option in your mind, a civil war?
I will not fire the first shot.
I don't think that we're going to see that, come to fruition anytime soon. But we did see what happened on January 6th. And that, for a lot of people, was an example of what they could do. Now my fear is you have to worry about state capitals.
What we know is that accountability matters, that every time these groups have been beaten back, sometimes it's after a horrific event like the Murrah Federal Building. But prosecution, enforcement, that has its own logic at depressing these organizations. But the accelerationist rhetoric that you describe throughout all these groups, really the Leninist idea that the worse it gets, the better it gets, is deeply embedded. And unless there is total accountability for January 6th, you're right, we could see more of this. And that's the heart of the militia problem in America, past, present, and future. Sarah Sidner, thanks for being part in our CNN Justice League on the Extremist Beat. It's good to see you.
Thank you, John.